Okay, we'll get started now. Welcome to Boost's CYAC webinar series. My name is Daniel Garfinkel, and I am going to be providing today's webinar. Before we begin our session, there's a few quick housekeeping points that I'm going to go over. For participants that are listening in French, you can click on floor at the bottom left of your screen and click on that, and you want to select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click presentation on the top left of the screen. That will allow you to see the slide deck that I'll be showing in a moment. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on Documents on the right. And please feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right hand side of your screen. I'll be doing a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of this webinar. So to submit your questions, you can go to the toolbar on the right. You're going to click on Messaging, and then you're going to click on Participants, the Participants tab, and you can type in your question, and you can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. I'll do my best to get to as many of those questions in the last few minutes of the presentation. Also, we do want to try to get an accurate count on the number of participants that are viewing this presentation. So if you are watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in your group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. Just indicate the number that is in your group. If you're viewing it on your own, there's no need to do that. And for those of you that are watching as a group, I trust that you are practicing safe physical distancing. Okay, I will begin our discussion. I'm really privileged today to be able to present to you on this topic. Before I get to my slides, I just want to say that I'm presenting today from my home in beautiful British Columbia. And I was joking with my family this morning about how I kind of feel like one of those entertainers or celebrities that are doing their television show from their own house. Now, my wife did point out that prior to COVID, I did not have a TV show, but let's not get carried away with all those minor details, right? Okay, I'm going to share my slides now. Okay, there we go. So I'm talking with you today about the importance of providing evidence-based trauma treatment to children and youth, focusing in particular on children and youth that have experienced child abuse. I'm a psychologist, and I'm also the director of services at the Treehouse Child and Youth Advocacy Center, and we are based in Vancouver. I think it's important just to set the stage here and talk about why this issue is important in the first place. And in a few minutes, I will provide a detailed description of what evidence-based means. For now, I'll just state that basically evidence-based means that the treatment has been shown to be effective. It's been demonstrated to be effective through rigorous research and evaluation. Why is evidence-based important, particularly in the context of treating traumatized kids and their families? Well, we know that the stakes are so high for these kids that have experienced abuse. Kids are taking a significant risk by disclosing their abuse. And we also know that being abused has many detrimental effects. It has the potential to derail healthy development in childhood, leading to an array of really concerning mental health and physical health outcomes across the lifespan. So we want to be sure that we are intervening with these kids and their families in a way that we know is going to be effective in order to mitigate those negative outcomes and set the child up for a healthy lifespan. Interestingly, despite those high stakes, issues of effectiveness and quality and safety in child trauma treatment have not been examined as thoroughly as some other treatments for other childhood conditions. So, for instance, there have been longstanding, over the past several decades, of research studies looking at treatments for childhood anxiety, for depression, for behavior problems. Those things have been studied quite rigorously, and there are a number of thoroughly researched, evidence-based treatments for those conditions. Similarly, treatment of trauma in adults has been rigorously examined over the course of the past several decades. Child trauma treatment, on the other hand, has received less scrutiny, really only until the past couple decades. It's really only in the past couple decades that we have been looking closely at the evidence base around providing trauma treatment to children and youth. And therapists or child trauma therapists have traditionally gravitated towards treatments that really emphasize the importance of connecting with the child's creativity, with their language of play, supporting the child in being able to enact through play what happened to them, resolve it through play. And those are all things that may be useful and effective for some kids, but have not been rigorously examined or studied using a scientific approach. And what we need really is examination of what works for kids and youth that have been traumatized. In terms of best practices in child trauma treatment, we are now at a point where there is some consensus about elements or components, features of best practices in child trauma treatment. On the right column on the slide, it's a list of some review papers which synthesize the research around best practices in treating kids that have been traumatized. And across those papers, as well as some other literature in the field, these are the 6 components that those bodies of work have in common. So best practices are to have treatments that are assessment driven. So we have we've been able to conceptualize the way in which the traumatic experiences have affected the child's development and their functioning. And that is going to dictate the way in which we are going to intervene. I'll be speaking about this component around evidence-based treatments or empirically supported treatment in a few moments. And then the treatment also needs to be trauma informed. The term trauma informed over the last few years is becoming very widely used. It's become very popular. And I worry that some of its meaning is starting to get lost in its popularity. And certainly no therapist and no organization is going to say that they're not trauma informed. But we do need to be clear about what that looks like. And it's more than simply checking off a box or attending a webinar. It goes above and beyond that. It also goes beyond just understanding trauma at the level of the individual. Rather, we need to look at the way in which systems and organizations may also reproduce trauma. Child trauma treatment needs to be developmentally sensitive. And what that means is that the way that we treat a 6-year-old is going to look different than how we treat a 16-year-old, which will also look different than how we will treat a developmentally delayed 16-year-old. So developmental stage is highly relevant to the manner in which we provide treatment. You'll also hear throughout this presentation about the importance of involving parents and caregivers in the treatment. We now know that doing therapy with an individual child and seeing just that child without involving either a parent or a caregiver in that process is likely to be ineffective and is not recommended at this time. And I'll be speaking more about that throughout the presentation. And finally, there's a focus in the treatment on some form of skill building, either with respect to the coping of the child or the parenting that is being provided to the child. And I'll be speaking about that as well throughout the presentation. With respect to the first point about the importance of having assessment-driven therapies, there are a number of things that the clinician should be looking at. Information that should be collected pertaining to, well, what happened to the child, what did the abuse or trauma consist of, looking at a range of different symptoms covering a number of different areas, looking at any significant risks that need to be immediately addressed, specifically regarding suicide, self-harm, other high-risk behaviors like drinking, substance use, promiscuity. Those things also need to be addressed and triaged in the work that you're doing. We have to look at families and caregivers that are embedded in the child's context, in their world. We want to understand relevant medical, mental health, and developmental history. That will inform how we treat. We want to look at the child's strengths. And that last point around readiness and engagement is also quite critical. And readiness, there's a couple different ways that we can understand readiness. One has to do with readiness for change, but that may be less important than more practical readiness. So I'm referring here to the ability of the family to transport themselves to a center or an agency for therapy, or in our current reality, do they have the technology in order to participate in virtual therapy? Those are all important questions. Now, regarding evidence-based treatments, what does this mean? There are three primary components to evidence-based treatment, and I'll be taking you through each of these. The first is best available research. The second is the clinical expertise of the therapist. And finally, the importance of knowing your client, their characteristics, their values, their context. We'll start with best available research. So this is where we are looking at and evaluating the evidence that suggests or that demonstrates that the treatment is effective. We need some scientific evidence that it works, that clients that receive that treatment are improving when we compare their functioning before treatment with their functioning after treatment. But more important than just seeing statistically significant change in scores, we also need to look closely at this concept of clinical significance. Do the change in scores in terms of their trauma symptoms, their behavior issues, in terms of the parenting, are the clients actually functioning better now that they have had the treatment? And this is what clinical significance might look like. We may have some clients who at the outset of treatment, they are functioning in the clinically significant range. They're having lots of nightmares, lots of flashbacks and intrusive memories about the abuse that they experienced, lots of emotional dysregulation. They're struggling in many different areas of their life. Parents are not coping well, and those areas of functioning may be in the clinically significant range, and it's through treatment that we would hope to see them progress towards functioning in the at-risk range, where there are still some concerns, but certainly there's improvement. And for some clients, they'll improve to the point where they are comparable to other kids, youth, and families that have not experienced the same issues. They would be considered to be in the average or normative range of functioning. In addition to clinical significance, we also need to scrutinize this concept of ecological validity. And what that means is that the scientific findings about effectiveness need to be generalized and applicable to the real world where our kids and families exist. Are the findings applicable to a community-based setting, not just to the hospital-based or teaching settings or university settings in which the treatments were developed and initially examined? The second component of evidence-based treatment is the expertise of the therapist. The therapist needs to be qualified and skilled at delivering the treatment and forming the therapeutic relationship with the client. All of those things need to be in place in order to successfully provide the treatment in the way that it's been shown to be effective. And finally, but also very importantly, is the importance of knowing your client, and that information about the clients, who they are, where they're from, what's important to them, what their values, information about their family, their culture, their context. Those are all things that need to be understood by the clinician and interwoven into the way that the treatment is carried out. The California Clearinghouse for Evidence-Based Practice in Child Welfare is a really useful resource. And what this California Clearinghouse has done is they have developed a rating scale which provides a score for different treatments based on the amount of evidence that exists that supports the treatment. And the scores range from 1, which would mean that it's well supported. There are multiple studies, randomized controlled studies, where the treatment is being compared. Clients who receive the treatment are being compared to other clients that have received other treatments or who are waiting for treatments. And there is follow-up on how those clients are doing following treatment, and then long-term follow-up several months later, a year later, 2 years later. So a score of 1 would be for treatments that have multiple studies, multiple independent studies that have demonstrated effectiveness in that way. A 2, there would be a couple studies. 3, there would be at least 1 well-designed, well-executed study. A 4 and a 5, a score of 4 or 5 would be provided if there is something harmful or specifically concerning about the treatment, or if there's evidence that suggests that the treatment is just not effective. Interestingly, most of the treatments that are being provided to kids and adolescents regarding trauma would fall in the NR, or not rated, category. What that means is that there's no studies that have evaluated the effectiveness of that treatment. We just don't know whether or not it works, and so it falls in that not rated category. There's really only a handful of child and adolescent trauma therapies that have that score of 1, and there are more under 2 and 3. In the province of British Columbia, about 10 years ago, the representative for children and youth commissioned a evaluation of the of our ministry or government funded sexual abuse intervention programs that deliver publicly funded treatment to kids that have been sexually abused in our province. And as part of that evaluation, it was found that there were around 30 different types of therapies being provided to kids and teens that had experienced sexual abuse. So 30 of them. And I would suspect that many of those would be falling in that not rated category. We just don't know enough about them in order to conclude that they are effective. The United States has really focused on developing and evaluating evidence-based treatments. And there has been a significant effort to train therapists that are working either within child advocacy centers or that provide services to kids that are seen through those centers, that work in partnership with those centers, or whether centers have contracted out or brokered partnerships with therapists. And I have a link here to a report released by the National Children's Alliance. That's the accrediting body for child advocacy centers in the United States. And this document describes those efforts to build capacity around providing evidence-based treatments. It also reports on mental health outcomes for kids and teens that have received those treatments. This graph, it's a little bit hard to read, so I'll take you through it. But what this report tells us is that evidence-based treatments can help reduce trauma symptoms, and specifically of the kids that were studied across CACs throughout the US, 75% of children who had post-traumatic stress disorder when they started their evidence-based treatment no longer met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder at their last follow-up. Not only does evidence-based treatment help with reducing trauma symptoms, but it also improves a number of other outcomes. There's an evidence-based treatment that is highly effective for children that are exhibiting problematic sexual behaviors. 78% of kids that receive that treatment no longer exhibit problematic sexual behavior. And then there are other outcomes that are not necessarily the target of trauma treatment, but for which those issues are improved. Those percentages, some of those are, around 50%, some below 30%, but those percentages are going to capture the kids and youth who entirely stop experiencing those challenges. There'll, of course, be many more youth who have decreases in the significance of those issues, but don't entirely stop. These percentages speak only to the complete stops regarding those life problems, and for kids who just no longer have PTSD at their last follow-up. But the link to that paper is on the slide. In Canada, in the last few years, we have the Vega project, which some of you may have heard of. This has been led by McMaster University in conjunction with a number of Canadian subject experts in the field of family violence. And the Vega project, as part of their work, they have completed a systematic review of several treatments for which there is some data collected, some studies available, and they have provided recommendations about treatments that are considered effective. Vega also provides a number of training resources for professionals that work in the family violence field. The recommendations with respect to treating children that have been abused, they've only recommended two. So one of them is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which I will be speaking about in detail in a few minutes. And the other is parent-child interaction therapy, which I will also talk about. But there are many other therapies that they have not recommended on the basis of the evidence. And this may be due to low sample size in the studies, lack of a long-term follow-up of the kids and teens that were studied, or there's a risk of bias in the way that the research was conducted. So they're very clear that any treatment delivered without a parent or caregiver, at least some extent involved, is not recommended. They're not recommending play therapy or music therapy. EMDR is also not recommended. However, the California Clearinghouse does state that there are several good studies of EMDR effectiveness in youth. There are some concerns, though, about some of those studies with respect to the size of the sample size and some other issues. As well, conducting CBT alone without looking at trauma is also not recommended. In terms of the treatments that have been shown to be effective, there are several core characteristics that all of these treatments have in common. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but the resource at the bottom of the screen, I think, is really valuable to anyone that's in a leadership role, in a child and youth advocacy center, anyone that is overseeing or managing or supervising therapy or therapy services, or any organizations that provide treatment to children and youth that have been abused. This document provides a number of helpful some helpful guidance in how to look for evidence-based treatments and how to build a therapy service around those. Okay. I'm going to talk about three specific evidence-based treatments. I'll start by talking about the child and family traumatic stress intervention, and then I'll talk about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and finally, I'll talk about parent-child interaction therapy. So starting with the child and family traumatic stress intervention, and I am going to say the complete title of that treatment. I'm trying to avoid using acronyms as this presentation is being interpreted, translated into French in real time, and those acronyms don't translate. So the child and family traumatic stress intervention is used with school-age kids and adolescents across many different types of traumas, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence exposure, and other natural disasters, other traumatic things that kids might go through. And it's specifically used or started in the 45 days immediately following the child's disclosure of abuse, disclosure in a forensic interview, for instance. And it's an early intervention. The purpose of it is to address the risk factors that have been shown to predict PTSD. So those risk factors would be poor coping of the child. And the second risk factor would be limited or unhelpful support being provided by the parents and caregivers. The treatment is going to target those areas. And it's a brief treatment that is intended to be delivered over a series of 4 to 6 sessions, and the sessions include the child and their parents. The goal of the treatment is to increase communication between the child and their parents, increasing the caregiver's support of the child, teaching skills that are going to enhance the way in which the child and their caregiver are coping with the trauma. And as well, the treatment assesses needs for long-term treatment. Some of these kids will require more treatment beyond this intervention. They might need something more long-term, like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, especially if their symptoms increase in severity or are especially complex. The evidence supporting this intervention are that children are less likely to have PTSD as well as anxiety symptoms after treatment and then 3 months later. And very importantly, there is a recent study which shows that parents also demonstrate decreased post-traumatic stress disorder following treatment. Really a critical finding, given the importance of parenting and parental support in children's recovery from abuse. In terms of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, this is the most widely used evidence-based therapy in child trauma treatment. It has become the gold standard, certainly in the United States, and we are finally starting to see some uptake of this treatment in different places in Canada. There are a number of different child advocacy centers that are now providing trauma-focused CBT. But there is certainly room for expansion of this treatment throughout other areas of Canada. It can be used across the age range of preschoolers to older adolescents. In order for this treatment to be used, there needs to be at least one traumatic event that the child has in their memory, that they're able to, that they remember, that they can talk about. And they also need to be experiencing some symptoms, some distress regarding the trauma that they experienced. If they have no symptoms, there would not be a need to do this treatment. There needs to be a supportive adult, preferably a parent or caregiver, involved in treatment. But we have seen therapists creatively involve other adults that play a significant role in the child or youth's life. And in terms of the evidence base, there are now actually close to 20 randomized controlled trials that have shown in which TF-CBT has been shown to be effective. Initially, trauma-focused CBT was developed for children that had been sexually abused and had fairly classic trauma symptoms. It has since been studied and applied and shown to be effective with kids and youth across many different types of trauma, across different developmental stages, in different settings, and with different cultures as well. There's a study that was done with traumatized youth in Central Africa. The goals of trauma-focused CBT are, of course, to reduce trauma symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, intrusive thoughts, memories, feelings about the abuse, hypervigilance, avoidance of reminders of the abuse or things that the child believes are related to the abuse, as well as feelings of shame, guilt, confusion, sadness, etc. The therapy also is intended to improve the quality of the relationship between the child and their caregiver, and it's building important self-regulation, self-efficacy, and life skills. Trauma-focused CBT is component-based, and on this screen there is a listing of those components, and the therapy is divided into thirds. There are 3 phases, each representing 1/3 of the treatment package, starting with a stabilization phase where information and teaching is provided to the child in psychoeducation. The child learns that they're not alone, that many other kids have experienced similar traumas and have responded in the same way as they have. And from there, the child learns about how to regulate or modulate their feelings, their ability they learn that they have control over their ability to relax their body, to cope with stress. They're learning skills about how to cope with unhelpful or inaccurate thoughts, how to challenge and correct those thoughts. And the entire process you see on the left here is gradual exposure, in which the child is being gradually exposed to thinking directly about what happened to them, and doing that with the therapist as part of treatment. And throughout the entire process, the parents are learning the same skills. They're learning how to understand and relate to their child. They're learning how to support their child in using those skills at home. In the second phase is where the child is supported in sharing in detail a narrative about what the abuse consisted of, what happened to them. And there's a number of different ways in this can be done. The child can write out the narrative with the therapist's help. It can be scribed. We've seen this done in some really interesting ways with song lyrics, with kids writing movie scripts. It's been done in some really artistic ways, primarily through pictures and drawings. And it's through developing that narrative that the therapist and the child start to really talk about the ways in which the child has experienced what happened to them, unhelpful cognitions about what happened to them. It's through that narrative where we might learn that the child blames themselves for the abuse happening, blames himself for not telling anybody right away or waiting a long time to disclose. Those are the types of things that are often elicited in that narrative phase. And in the final phase, the child is going to share their narrative with the parent who has been prepped by the therapist in how to respond in a way that will be helpful to their child. And at that point, there will also be some work done with the child regarding how some safety skills that they have within their control. It says there at the far left that this is typically done over the course of 8 to 16 sessions. We do know that for youth that have experienced complex trauma, that have essentially grown up with trauma, they may very well need treatment to extend into 20, 25, upwards of possibly 30 sessions. And if the youth is engaging in some high risk behaviors, that stabilization phase will need to incorporate the components around enhancing safety first and foremost, and that phase will be longer than the trauma narrative and integration phases. There are reference manuals that in which you can learn about trauma-focused CBT. The second book looks at the way in which trauma-focused CBT has been adapted for a number of different populations. So there's now resources for clinicians to implement TF-CBT with kids in foster care and residential treatment, kids that are experiencing ongoing traumas, those that are growing up in military families, those that are exhibiting behavior problems. And recently, there's resources to provide TF-CBT for youth that are being commercially sexually exploited. And there's also now an implementation manual for providing trauma-focused CBT to youth that identify as LGBTQ. The link below will take you to those resources. If you are not familiar with trauma-focused CBT, have not received any training on trauma-focused CBT, I would encourage you to take the online training that's available through the developers. And it walks you through the principles and objectives of trauma-focused CBT and each of those components. There are a number of demonstration videos in the training that show how each of those components are utilized. Parent-child interaction therapy. This was initially developed for young kids that were exhibiting a lot of disruptive externalizing behavior and to assist their parents in being able to manage those behaviors and form a better, improved relationship with their child. It has since been adapted for use with kids that have experienced trauma. And I'll direct you in a few moments to the some of those resources for the adapted version with traumatized kids. The objective here is to improve the quality of the parent-child relationship, to change parent-child interaction therapy, parent-child interaction patterns. The picture in the bottom right of the slide gives you a picture of what this looks like. So we have the parent and the child are in a small room together, and they are playing with some toys together. The parent has a bug in their ear, and the therapist is behind the mirror providing live coaching to that parent, supporting that parent in using some new skills to build the relationship with their child, as well as taking charge of their child in a kind way. This type of therapist support is going to boost the parent's confidence and enable them to be able to effectively parent their child and deal with some really challenging behaviors that their child may be exhibiting. Parent-child interaction therapy is by far the most well-researched and effective treatment for kids in the preschool, early school years who have disruptive behaviors. And there is also strong evidence that it's effective with kids that have been abused. It reduces their trauma symptoms. It reduces the parent's own stress, which is closely connected to and very influential on how their child is doing. It also has been shown to reduce recurrence of physical abuse. So PCIT has been effective where there's been physical abuse in the family, and PCIT is the intervention to lower the risk that physical abuse will recur. There's a link at the bottom to web-based materials for learning about parent-child interaction therapy. As well, there is a online training that walks you through the use of parent-child interaction therapy for traumatized kids. The link is also on the screen. This next slide lists a number of other treatments that do have evidence that have been shown to be effective with some kids and youth. That would include EMDR, which is a preference of many therapists. And some of the bodies that review treatments have said that trauma-focused CBT should be the first line go-to for kids that have experienced abuse. And if the youth is not responding to trauma-focused CBT, then you may want to consider trying EMDR. Prolonged exposure treatment for adolescents has been shown to be more effective than supportive therapy. And then there's dialectical behavior therapy, which is not meant for trauma symptoms, but its use with adolescents might be especially helpful when you have a teenager in therapy who's engaging in a lot of high-risk behaviors, really struggling with emotional regulation and distress tolerance, and they may require something such as dialectical behavior therapy to ready themselves to benefit from trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. For children with problematic sexual behavior, there's also a targeted treatment for them. There's a link to the National Child Sexual Behavior of Youth organization, which has developed an evidence-based treatment for kids with problematic sexual behavior. The treatments on the right-hand side focus on the parenting, the parent-child relationship, and in particular the attachment between parent and child. Dyadic developmental psychotherapy has a controversial history, but in the last 10 years has been revamped and revised, and recently there's been some impressive research on the effectiveness of that treatment, especially with young kids that have experienced very early relational trauma. Circle of Security Parenting and the Connect Parent Group, which look at the attachment relationship and attachment principles. Those are now being utilized at a few child advocacy centers in Canada. And finally, Alternative for Families CBT is used for families in which there has been physical abuse, and it is meant to enhance the physical and emotional safety of the children in that home, and it's been shown also to reduce recurrence of physical abuse. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's been limited uptake of evidence-based treatments in Canada. Therapists are gravitating to many other therapies. And the critiques of that therapists have about evidence-based treatments, I think are worthy of discussion. These are things that we should be talking about and having dialogue about. And I've listed the most common reasons why therapists are not inclined to try evidence-based treatments. One point that has been made is that these evidence-based treatments refer a lot to post-traumatic stress disorder, and they appear to be designed to treat just that single disorder. So yes, initially, when many of these treatments were first developed, they were intended to reduce classic trauma symptoms. They have since been shown to be effective with an array of heterogeneous trauma reactions that kids and youth might be exhibiting. There's also been the point made that the client is just, is too complex for these evidence-based treatments. They've grown up with trauma. The trauma is quite complex. How could trauma-focused CBT be used with a client that has just experienced one trauma after another? How would they possibly do a narrative about their trauma? There's just too many. And in those situations, trauma-focused CBT does have an adapted way of delivering it, in which the child or youth is supported in identifying themes across those traumas that they've experienced. For instance, the theme that they believe they can't trust anyone, and that would be the focus of their narrative. There's been some critiques that these treatments have been developed and evaluated in lab or hospital settings, in teaching universities. We now know that these treatments have been applied and adapted and generalized across many diverse settings. Trauma-focused CBT has been evaluated in multiple different contexts, in multiple different continents, in some very low resource environments. Another critique is that the therapeutic relationship between the client and the therapist, it seems secondary to the skills and strategies that are taught in therapy. In my experience as a therapist, I would say that the therapeutic relationship is absolutely fundamental and essential. Without that relationship, you're not going to be effective with a client. That being said, the therapeutic relationship is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's not enough to produce significant, lasting change. There needs to be more than just a relationship. The therapist needs to be engaging the client in activities that are going to promote recovery from abuse. And of course, ensuring that the client is anchored in a relationship with their caregivers. Another concern is that with these treatments, especially the one that I first mentioned, the child and family traumatic stress intervention, that is meant to be delivered in those, starting in those 40, 45 days following the child's disclosure, but we have a 10-month wait list or more. How can we possibly deliver this treatment and start it in those first 45 days? In terms of that issue, which is a real issue for many of our organizations, we cannot just put all of our referrals onto into one basket, onto one wait list. We need to carefully triage those referrals. We tend to triage based on acuity and severity. Yes, that's one thing that's very important. We don't want to have a youth that is suicidal on a one-year wait list. We also, though, want to ensure that we're able to provide services to those kids and youth who are presenting with mild symptoms that would benefit from short-term treatment. We want to be able to intervene quickly with those kids to prevent those mild symptoms from increasing in severity as they wait longer and longer for treatment. There's concerns about training costs. Again, a valid point. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is less expensive in terms of training than the others that I've presented on, and we are hoping that we'll eventually have some Canadian trainers in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that can make this more accessible for therapists in our country. Another issue is that these therapists are made in the USA. There's no question mark beside that point, because indeed that is true. And the final point is that evidence-based treatments, there's been some concerns that it's too prescriptive, it's manualized. There really isn't any room for the therapist to be creative. It's just far too prescriptive. And some therapists just do not believe that is helpful in their practice. That is something that I think is important, of course, to talk about, because we know that these evidence-based therapies can be delivered in flexible, creative ways while maintaining fidelity to the treatment model. I have seen some colleagues deliver trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, in a way in which they use play or expressive arts as the medium for delivering that treatment. Expressive arts is the narrative that they are, the medium for the narrative that they are providing. I have a list here of a number of helpful resources that I have cited throughout the presentation. At the bottom of the screen are resources for delivering trauma-focused CBT and parent-child interaction therapy through virtual means. Those would be especially relevant in this day and age. Just to very briefly plug the center that I work with. So we are based in Vancouver, and we are a child and youth advocacy center. Our focus is to help children in Vancouver who have experienced abuse get back to feeling like kids again. There are many different ways that you are able to contact the Treehouse or myself. Our website link is there. Our Facebook is there. You can find us on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. I'm going to close the slide. And I'm going to now go to the questions. And we have 6 minutes left. I understand that I do need to be done at the hour exactly. Let's see these questions. If there are any here. Don't see any yet, but you're welcome to include some. And of course, you're welcome to contact me directly with any follow-up questions regarding the materials and the information that I've shared today. So we have a question from Jana. Can you revisit the connection between art therapy and evidence-based therapy? Right. So at present, the reviewers or the reviewing bodies that have looked at different types of therapy have not yet found evidence that art therapy specifically has demonstrated effectiveness in treating children and youth that have experienced child abuse. That being said, it also has not been explicitly studied, particularly in the way that it can be delivered in conjunction with trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. So the developers of trauma-focused therapy have said that absolutely art therapy can be used as the medium for delivering the components of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. The child can create art, and that would serve as the springboard for their narrative. Question from Sue: can you speak to the reasons that parents or caregivers need to be involved in a youth's trauma therapy? That's such a great question. We know that recovery from trauma is very closely connected to the support that the youth is receiving from their parents or caregivers. Our youth do not exist. They do not function in isolation to the caregivers in their life. They need support. They're not yet adults. Even adults need support of people in their life. I'm often asked the question, well, what if there's no, the youth has no parents, there's no caregiver in their life, they have no significant relationships. If the youth is 19, 18, 19 years old, you may be able to proceed with individual treatment. But for anyone in mid-adolescence or certainly younger, certainly in a child, if there is no significant relationship with an adult, that would be the focus of treatment. You would not do trauma-focused CBT until that child or adolescent is anchored in a secure relationship. You would first focus on that. I have some questions that are under the operators. Here we go. What about if the client turns 19 recently? Is it okay to involve the parents? At that age, the youth would, of course, need to be providing consent to involve the parents. I think it's important to have someone that the youth has a significant relationship with in treatment to some extent. There's something like PCIT for older children that has been shown to help in cases of trauma. There are other therapies that focus on the attachment relationship between the youth and their parents. Those treatments still focus on the parents. They may not directly involve the youth in the therapy, like program like the Connect Parent Group. You're welcome to email me, and I'll provide a more detailed answer to that question. There's another. I have 1 minute left. From this last question about, other than good quality evidence, are there other factors that would be taken into account when using an approach like trauma-focused CBT versus the more attachment-based approach? Yes, there are factors that would be looked at in your assessment. Where attachment issues seem to be at the forefront of what's happening for the child that's driving the symptoms, you would look at a more attachment-focused approach. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this presentation. I hope you found this to be helpful to you. Please download the slides, and please feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions. Thank you.